Today we're going to talk about collaboration. And collaboration has been, it was a religious war. It was certainly a religious war. And Cisco has played the biggest part in this religious war. They really started it. They really started it. We're going to talk about how we've gone from IP telephony to unified communications to what we call collaboration today, and all the little different parts and pieces that go into it. So John Chambers, like I said, in 1997 stood up, and this is we're going to start with the fundamentals of collaboration and the history of it. I think it's easier to talk about the history all the way through. 1997, John Chambers stood up in front of a bunch of investors, said two things. Long distance charges are going to be free. And back then, long distance charges were, a lot of people don't remember when long distance charges were very, very expensive. Yeah, 80, 90 cents a minute just to talk on a phone. 80 or 90 cents a minute. Think about it. You don't just pick up the phone and say, hey, let's talk about what you did last night. What did you think of that football game? How's your kids doing? All this. A lot of money tied up in that. Customers were having to go back to their bills and say, hey, listen, we're looking for all these charges where people were on these excessively long calls and all this. There was a lot of billing issues. Billing was really, really important to be able to find out where your bills charges were because they were significant, very significant. So they said long distance charges were going to be free and voice and data networks were going to converge. Convergence was born when John said that. And again, we didn't have anything on the web because there was no blogs or anything on the web, but the magazines I used to get magazines at my house, telecommunications magazines, because I was a phone guy and everything. And I get these magazines, they used to send it out, and it was John, what's John, in essence, what's John thinking? There's no way we're going to do it. There's no way voice will go on a data network. Because data networks back then were very unreliable. People still used a lot of hubs. A lot of people were still using hubs. They had not seen the value of switches yet. And John's saying we're going to put our most effective and most meaningful communications method on these networks. No way. No way it's going to happen. But again, they had a vision, a strategy. They started acquiring companies, acquiring technologies, developing technologies inside of their core products, the routers and switches. And then they acquired a small company called Celsius. Now again, Celsius was actually a company out of Dallas, Texas that was trying to do video. They were trying to do video and they couldn't do it. They were using a protocol called H323. The protocol was not as thin as SIPs is, and there was a lot of issues around there. The clients couldn't support it. And all this. So what they did is for a business model, they actually changed their business model and said, well, instead of doing video, let's just do voice. So we'll take H323, cut all the video side out of it, make it a thinner client so our phones can use it, and just do voice and do what we called an IP PBX. A little box that's a server that did everything that a big PBX did. And that's what they wanted. Now again, Nortel looked at them. And Nortel had told them that when we acquire you, we're actually going to put your technology in a shelf or in a desk or in a trash can somewhere. But Cisco acquired the company, and they acquired them in 1998, 1999. By the way, we had the ugliest phones I've ever seen. I would have never put those phones on my desktop. Those old 12SP phones were the ugliest things I've ever seen in my life, I think. I said, where did they get this out of? The 1940s? I mean, I'd seen early key system phones that were much more attractive than those 12SPs. But we had a strategy and a vision to develop on it. So let's just look at how Cisco did that. And again, Cisco did a lot. This is the first time that Cisco did what they did in data center. They had a clean slate. If I could draw a pretty picture, I could certainly draw it up here pretty easy without anything because it's free. Our competitors, the traditional vendors, Siemens, Alcatel, Nortel, Avaya, all had a significant investment in that traditional world. And I'll never talk bad about a PBX. I won't. Because a PBX did its job longer than any product I've ever seen for as long as I've ever seen, and done it well, very, very well. But we changed. It's us that changed. Our requirements changed. And that's why IP telephony took off. It wasn't that we had more features, obviously not. It wasn't that we were significantly cheaper. No. Matter of fact, in a lot of cases, and we'll talk about it, people would say, oh my God, your solution's expensive. Well, it was at the time, and we'll talk about why it was. But it was the vision and strategy that matched along the waves of changes inside of a business. The mobility, the need to be able to integrate applications and things like that the PBX would never do. It was very, very hard to get that to work. So let's just talk about a PBX. And again, you had a voice network. So you had phones connected to a box called a PBX that connected up to the PSTN, which connected up to, let's say if you had a branch office, another PBX or a key telephony system, a smaller PBX, to another phone. Let me draw that correctly. Over here. The PBX, that was one network, the most significant network a customer had. This was the most important network that they had to communicate, not only with their other users, but with their customers, because everybody in the world was on the PSTN, the first global network. At the time, we started making this separate network. A separate network. Two different groups, separate. When I was at Blue Cross and Blue Shield, I managed both of these. I was the operational manager for them. We had an Avaya G3R PBX, for my preference in PBXs of all the ones I've worked at, and we had a nice infrastructure for data infrastructure for our network. Two different managements. I called it bowlers and golfers. If I wanted to do anything with my voice guys, I go bowling with them. They were in bowling leagues. They did all kinds of things in bowling and stuff. If I wanted to go out with my IT guys, I had to go golfing. The thing about it is, I'd really love to switch my scores. I really would, because I was pretty good at bowling. 140, 150 and everything. But golfing, I was just terrible. I just could not hit that little ball straight at all. And then when I turned one way, I'd hook it or slice it the other way. So, but that's what I'd have to do. Two different organizations, two different things. Now, let's just look at which one of these do you think had more contact or more understood the business better? Who do you think understood the business better? Excuse me? The technicians knew it, but which group do you think really understood the business better? The voice people. The voice people knew. Now, a day in the life of my IP technician would be sitting behind a door, playing around with switching and routing and this, that, and the other of people, That's all they did. They were locked behind a door and everything. What about my phone technicians? I had a really good phone technician. His name was Ronnie. Really good guy. Kind of rough around the edges. You had to worry about what he was saying in front of a lot of customers because, he'd tell dirty jokes and politically incorrect kind of guy. But you know what? He knew exactly what was going on with the business. He knew exactly what was going on over there. Because when somebody wanted a phone moved or if they wanted a call center change, the call center, they say, hey, we need to change the prompts on our IVR or do this, that, and the other. Guess what he'd do? He'd walk over there, he'd sit down with them and say, what do you want done? Why are you doing this? Whatever. The phone people were actually more engaged with the user than our IT guys because they had a bunch of servers out there and everything. I'm telling you, a phone technician knew what was going on over there because you know what? He'd go over to a secretary, be moving a secretary's set or doing something like that and say, what's going on? And he'd get all the scoop and everything. They really knew. If they might not do anything with it, but they knew because they were outside. They were moving phones here and doing things here. They were considered a more critical part of the business. They really were. Now, I do make the proposition that everything that we learned here, we stole from here. And and everything. And I do believe it's easier for, it was much easier for, I think, for a phone technician to learn this than these guys to learn that. And I've had in the past several people try to go back and forth, and it's proven, in my history, it's proven true. But we had these two networks. And IP telephony, although it was born in the late 90s, early 2000s, we'd been doing another technology called voice over IP for years, voice over technologies. So think about it. I want to call someone across here. I pick up a phone on my PBX. I dial to get an outside line. Again, inside of, wrong color. Inside of this PBX, there's a portion of that called a dial plan. I can spell it. A dial plan. It tells you what number to dial to do certain things. If I want to dial a direct extension, I dial your extension directly, whether it be 3, 4, or 5 digits. But if I want to dial an outside line here in the U.S., we dial 9. And all the PBXs is kind of, in some countries it's 0, in some countries it's different numbers, but in the United States it's 9. So if I told you to go back there, let's order pizza for lunch, what do? You pick up the phone, the first thing, here's the number, you dial 9 first and then the number. The dial out. That's got to be provisioned inside of this PBX. So the first thing they might dial is 9. And that tells this PBX it's going out of the system. Then you would dial an area code or country code. Then you would dial an area code, what we call an NNX, and in other parts of the world it's the city code, maybe a city code. Here we call it the NNX, Network Number Exchange. And then the extension that we want, 4 digits. Here. And it goes out. Goes to the PSTN. They have routing tables here that routes every number in the world. Every country code, every area code, that's PSTN. And it would deliver that call here and deliver to this PBX. This PBX would say, all right, it's this extension, and this phone would ring, and then we would get a toll charge per minute once it was hooked up, once we got answer supervision. Well, in the late 80s, customers were doing this, and charges were a lot of money. Back then, it was closer to $1, $1.25 a minute for long distance. International charges were well over that. So customers tried to figure out a way around that. They're trying to cut their budget. So they said, wait a second, we've got this other network, a data network here. What do you pay for your WAN? How do you pay for your WAN? You pay for bandwidth, right? On a monthly charge. So if I have bandwidth here, could I use to drive phone calls here? That was just a logical, could I do that? Well, actually we could. What device might we use to connect these two dissimilar networks? A router. So early on, what we do is we would put some hardware in this router and some software, and we would connect it up to the PBX. We would go back to this guy's dial plan and say, you know what, if they're calling across to this guy here, we're wanting to use this path first. And then we do the same thing over here. We put some hardware in and put it up here. And we would take this call, the first call would come across here, go down here as traditional voice. And then this router, we gave the router the ability to say yes or no. He could actually push back on that PBX and say, no, I don't have available. I can't do this. So we wanted to limit the calls. Early QoS is what it was. So if I dialed this number, the voice would go down here, and then this router would encapsulate voice in whatever technology we're using. Voice over ATM, voice over frame relay, voice over IP. Whatever technology I was using, we would do that. It's called voice over technology, and this was so 1990-ish. This is 1990s and to 1995. This is where this stuff, people were using this all the time. Matter of fact, Cisco came out with a very specific router. I used to love this router back in the mid-90s. They came out with a little 3810, a little router that was designed to do nothing but this. And man, I bought and put in a ton of those little boxes. They had a little module in it. You could order it for voice over ATM, voice over IP, voice over frame reader, whatever you wanted. You can hook it up and put it. But the thing about it is so I put the first call goes across here. I limit the bandwidth. I say, listen, I'm going to have bandwidth for 2 calls. I'll have bandwidth for 2 calls. So I reserve enough bandwidth for 2 calls to go across here. And the third call. So the first call goes across, it works. Second call goes across, it works. Third call tries to come down here. The router says no, sorry. Goes back to the PBX, says I can't accomplish that call. He goes to the second, well, what's my next option? And then he'll send it out this way. Of course, they get a toll charge, but the call happens. It worked really, really well. Really, really well. The thing that made this work really well is we had the control on the sides. Because eventually, as these calls are up, somebody over here is going to start pulling data or moving data across here. So data starts flowing through here. We got voice going across here, wrapped up in data. Who was the person who did the slowed data down? The router. We would provision the router to slow down data so the voice happened. Because what's the difference between voice and data is voice has got a very, very short time limit. It's got to get there. Data's just got to get there. It's got to get there intact. Voice has just got to get there quick. Now, the good thing about it is voice is just small packets. Just small packets going across there. So the routers played a key role in this. And we did this over and over and over and over for our customers, letting them leverage this to save money. This is voice over technology, voice over IP. And the business value of it is toll bypass. So those are terms that you've heard. Our competition, when we got into IP telephony, the first thing they started calling our solution was voice over IP. That's voice over IP. It's not what we do. We do IP telephony. There's a big difference, and I'll show it to you. But that's voice over technologies. And it's been around forever. I cannot tell you how many times I used to, because I could work on the PBXs and I could work on the routers, and on weekends, that's how I made extra money. So I'd know somebody and they'd say, hey, listen, we've got this, we want to do it. I'd sit and plan with them for 1 week. What they'd want to do, we'd order the equipment, they'd pay me money, and what they'd do is on Friday night I'd come in and I'd hook up the router on the one side. Saturday morning I'd fly to a far end, hook up the router on the other PBX, make sure everything works, fly back. They give me money and I blow it. I spend on hunting, fishing, or tequila, probably, or Jim Beam. That's probably the big thing I'd spend it on. But that was a way for these networks to start converging early, but they really weren't. They were just leveraging this. But when Cisco came out with IP telephony, they said, we're going to deploy voice as an application, strictly as an application. And the biggest thing I did was educate my customers. I was very, very, very successful with IP telephony sales early on because I used to be a telecom manager. So I could talk their talk and talk their language. And when I went in there, I didn't go in and tell them, hey, listen, we're ripping your crap out and you're useless and all this. No, because that's what they're thinking. That's their risk. That's what they're thinking. I would go in and talk to them about the next generation of telephony and how it's going to look. And actually, Cisco can give you that next generation today. We're not going to have to take you through a step. And the network is going to matter. And you have to remember, the network does matter here. So here's what I would do with the average. I would go into a customer. I go into the telecom department. The first thing he'd say is, who in the hell are you? Never seen you before. You've been going over here to the data side and giving those guys T-shirts, golf balls, buying them lunch and everything for years, and now you got lost? You came in my office? And I'd say, no. I said, I'm Eddie with Cisco, and I'm here to talk to you about the future of telephony and how this convergence of the two networks is going to happen, and how you see it. What is your thoughts around this? I used to sit in your seat and I'd tell him. I'd say, and he'd say, well, and I said, look, no horns, no long tail. I'm not the devil. I'm just here to talk to you. And then we'd get into the discussion. I'd say, well, here's they'd give me, we'd start, and I'd say, well, let me just show you what I think is going to happen. I'll say, you know, a PBX that we've got here has really got 5 functional areas. And I draw this up. 5 functional areas in a PBX. You have cards that we call trunk cards. Trunk cards in the PBX connect us out to the PSTN, outside of our buildings. These could be PRIs, digital. These could be analog, business class lines, whatever they are. Connect this up out, what we use. Down here we have station cards. Our station cards, that's where we actually put the phones. Whether it's an analog phone, a digital phone, a modem. Really didn't like putting modems on my PBX, but I had to. Whatever it is, I'd have to put that there. And these station cards would fit in here and we'd connect these things up. It had a CPU. Generally, most PBXs only had one CPU. We didn't have all this stuff. You had to buy the largest PBXs to get 2 CPUs. Had to be a pretty good sized company for that. But I'm not saying that it was bad or anything. These were very reliable. And this is where you did all your provisioning. Your provisioning. So if you got a new employee, you wanted to give them a phone. You go to this console and you say, add a new phone. And you'd add the phone, the type of phone that you were going to add, whether it was a proprietary digital phone or if it was just a regular analog phone. We'd give them their extension numbers and all their features. You know, what happens when it rings, no answers? Do we forward it to voicemail? Whatever it is. That's where you put all that stuff in. That's what my phone technicians did all the time. That's the CPU. We did all that. It's where we had our dial plan, our routing table. Ha ha ha. Before there was a router, there was a routing table in a PBX. Yep. Before there was a router, there was a routing table in a PBX. Because I might have multiple vendors here. I might have here in the U.S., I had AT&T as a long-distance provider and MCI as a long-distance provider. One of them would give me one rate for long distances and local calls, and one would give me a different rate for long distance. And if MCI was cheaper to do local calls, I'd send all my local calls out MCI first, because AT&T might be longer, cheaper for long distance calls. I had to do that. Do least cost routing, is what it was called, across my carriers. Down here I had shared resources. Shared resources. Probably the only place I might have, 2 power supplies in here. Do you know where dial tone comes from on a traditional phone? On a PBX? Where's dial tone come from? Anybody know? Where's dial tone come from? It comes from a card. It's a tone card in there. It's called a dial tone card. It sits inside of that box all day long and does this. Duh. And when you go off hook on your phone, this phone tells the CPU, the card does, says this guy went off hook, what do you expect to hear? You expect to hear dial tone. So he says, hook this dial tone to that guy's ear so he knows that the phone's working. Because if you picked up a phone and you didn't get dial tone, what's the first thing you think? It's not working. It's called a supervisory tone. It's a supervisory tone. It's a supervisory tone that tells you I'm ready to receive digits because you're going to dial something. So on your ear, you hear dial tone. On the return back, I put something here called a DTMF receiver. It's a card that can translate those DTMF tones that you send into the digits you dialed. So he can tell this guy what numbers you're trying to dial. That's how they worked. And we'd have these cards in there. We'd have a tone in there for ringtone. So when you heard it ring back, like it's called ringback tone. A card that did nothing but provide that to you. All these little tone cards in there that went in this box. Why did your phone ring? Why did your phone ring? How did your phone ring? Well, this is the fun part. This was the little cool thing. We had something called ring voltage. Ring voltage, a ring voltage generator. 20 hertz at 90 volts. It's like sticking your finger in that socket over there. That's what it is. And what we would do is if somebody called your phone, when it hit this, if I called from one phone to the other, in order to let you know that phone would ring and make that phone ring, I'd stick electricity to it. Yeet! Yeet! That's what would do it. And that was a really fun little trick to do on your little friends, right? I used to find people who'd be going down, moving a phone here, there, and everywhere. And I'd wait till they were probably about halfway through, or I might even look around the corner just to see what they're doing with the wires. And then I'd call the phone extension. And man, you'd see them jump by. We had these big wire frames, and you knew somebody was ringing somewhere, and you had all these wires with electrical connections in there, and you'd be walking by, and somebody just lean you over to them, you'd hit it over here, and you knew somebody was, you'd get shocked. Yeah, that was kind of like the little sick little things that we did. Sounds like fun. It was fun. It was fun if you were on the giving side instead of the receiving side. Absolutely.
What's that saying? Youth passes away, but immaturity lasts a lifetime.
Exactly. I still laugh about doing that sometimes, but I got it many times too. So it was. But that's what a PBX was, and it was very reliable. I'm not going to ever talk bad about it and everything. Now, what tied all this together was a TDM bus, a bus that said I can send so many of these calls across at one time.
There was also a message card, no? When you recorded all the messages that you were going to get when you...
Well, that's eventually you could get that if you had an ACD and all this, but for just basic PBX functionality, this is all you had to have. Well, I'll add to that in a few minutes. But there's a lot. This is what made this thing work. Now, let me give you an example. So let's say that I was a company that had 400 employees. I want to have my own PBX. My PBX might be outdated, outgrown, or whatever. I have to get a PBX, and the salesperson comes here and says, Eddie, we're going to sell you a PBX that supports 878 phones. Well, I've only got 400 people, 400 phones now. A little less than 400 phones, man. I can double the size of my company. That's kind of cool. I buy the PBX. How did he know I could put 878 phones on that? Those 64 kilobits per second bandwidth, they knew what the average was of oversubscribing and this, that, and the other, how many cards you could put in, how many trunks you'd probably have to have. And they kind of came up with this number that said 878. And they say, okay, and now we want you to use our phones. You have to use our phones. What? Yeah, you have to use my phones. If I had a Nortel PBX, could I hook an Avaya phone up to it? Absolutely not. Could not do it. If I was part of I worked at American Airlines, a huge company, and I was lucky enough to go to what we call the North American PBX Users Group down in Florida. They do this in the winter in Florida, which is nice because you get nice weather there. They wine and dine you more than dine you. And they took us down there, and this is back in the late 80s. And they sent us these little surveys. After you registered everything in the mail, not an email because we didn't have email. But they sent you these surveys saying, give me your top 5 reasons things that you like about your vendor and things you don't like about your vendor. And they were going to take all these people who were coming down here and show you the survey results. Went down there. Number 1 in dissatisfaction is the proprietary nature of these boxes. I went down there and I saw a Siemens phone. And I thought it was the cutest phone I'd ever seen. I'll never forget going through because Siemens is not big in the U.S. and everything. I'd seen them around and everything. But they came out with a new phone, and it was as cute a little phone as I've ever seen. And I just loved to use that phone, but I couldn't use it. Why? We didn't use Siemens PBXs. We didn't use Siemens PBXs. So the number 1 thing back in the late 80s, for the first 3 years, number 1 complaint from the users, proprietary nature of can't use your cards, can't use all this. Had to use your stuff. And they proved the point. If you just ignore people who are complaining, they will eventually quit complaining because they weren't changing. No, the first year they said, well, we're trying to, and we'd really like to, and, we're working. We've got all of us getting together. But, our phones will really do a lot of difference, and they might not be able to do that. The second year, yeah, we had those meetings, but these other people don't want to work with us, and we want to be able to give you the best possible service. Whatever story they could spin it, however they could spin it, eventually, 4 years into it, that dropped from number 1 to number 3. Because people just expected it to be that way. And that was in the late 80s. In the year 2000, could I use a Avaya phone on a Nortel PBX digital phone? Absolutely not. There were no way you could do that. You were stuck with your vendor. You were stuck with your vendor. Yeah. But, hey, we'll see if that comes back. But the box worked. So 878 phones. So a year goes by, my company grows, I start adding phones, putting new cards in here. Somebody starts saying, hey, listen, Eddie, we need to have a voice messaging system up here. We certainly do. We better connect up to it and have trunks to go up to it. Hey, we need to have more connections out here because we're making a lot more calls. We might insert a contact center or something where we have to have recordings and all that in here. All these different cards that we were putting in there. All of a sudden, I've got 652 phones on this. I get a call on Friday. My boss tells me, Eddie, we've got a new director coming in over in one of our business units. We got to give him a phone. Okay. Start typing up. Add a new phone. It comes back and says, no more ports available. No more ports available. What do you do? Yeah.
Your extension.
The first thing you do is go find a modem or something you can get rid of. You give the guy the phone and you call your salesperson. You call your salesperson. Now, my salesperson at Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina, his name was Dave. Great guy. He was a great salesperson. He was a great sales guy. And he had this one line that he used to use all the time on me and on everybody. We'll take care of you. That's what he used to say. So I can imagine this conversation. Hello, Dave, this is Eddie. Hey, I know it's Friday and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but listen, I just went to add a phone and I don't have any more ports on my PBX. First thing Dave's going to say is, Eddie, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take care of you. I said, well, here's what I did, and I'm going to start cleaning this thing up because there's always extensions that I might not be able to use. But Dave, it's done. He says, I'm going to cancel all my meetings for Monday. I'm going to come down there. We're going to plan this out. I'll take care of you, Eddie. Don't worry about it. Just leave me the first half of your day on Monday. We'll fix this. Okay, Dave. Click. Dave picks up the phone in his office, and he calls his wife Lois, and Lois is the sweetest little lady ever met. I've loved her to death. He's going to say, Lois, honey, get your best dress out. We're going out to dinner. I just sold another one. That's what he did. Yeah, that's what he's going to do. Because guess what? What do you have to do once you outgrow these things?
Change it.
You have to change it. You have to buy a new one. What I'm going to do is that's called the golden phone. It's what they call the golden phone. They got the title just for that, the golden phone. What am I going to do? I'm going to have bigger and I'm going to roll it in. And I'm going to try to migrate all this onto it in some kind of reasonable fashion. I'm going to unbolt this, and I'm going to put this here and bolt it back in. I get to keep the phones, probably, most of the cases. That's the way we lived. That's the way we lived all the way through the 80s and 90s, folks. That was life. That was life, and expected life, and customers lived with it. Customers lived with it. Are our expectations a little bit different from a customer perspective today? Yeah. How many times have you ever used or told somebody that's a proprietary? That's not good. They got away with it for 30 years, 40 years, and nobody ever said anything. They just lived with it. Lived with it. This thing's very reliable. Maintenance on this thing. Upgrades. How much was maintenance on a PBX? 18 to 22%. That's about it. So Blue Cross and Blue Shield had a G3R. Loved that box. God, I loved that box. I keep saying that, but I'm telling you, it was the greatest PBX I've ever worked with. But got a call. We just re-signed our maintenance agreement, and we had the high end of this. Every time I added a phone, it was $1.25 on my maintenance. Every time I added a phone. Every time. Were the phones cheap? You know, Cisco was always told, our phones are expensive. Were their phones expensive or cheap? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. In 1995, a desktop phone for a manager with my deep discount was $433. for a desktop phone. My call center phones were $800, the Callmaster phones. $800 for a phone after my discount. Yet when Cisco entered the market, what were we? Our phones were expensive. Boy, they did a really good job of twisting all this. They did a really good job. They were good at what they did. But maintenance. So we, December of 1995, my boss, Mike Sarosi, came down this hallway and had a PO, white piece of paper. Our POs were white at Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And he just went up and got executive sign-off on our maintenance contract. A maintenance contract on our PBX for a 3-year period was $978,000. $978,000. And he walked down the hallway, and I saw him walking down the hallway, and he had this. He goes, Eddie, Eddie, Eddie. And he's waving this piece of paper at me. He goes, $1 million for your PBX. That's what it is. I'm like, man, I didn't choose this. I just started working here like, 9 months ago. $1 million. That's how much we're paying. Oh, God, please, Christmas come along. So I took Christmas break off. Before the end of January, got a call from Dave. Hey, Eddie, how you doing? I'm doing great, Dave. How was your holidays? Really good. Lois and I saw the grandkids. How was yours? Oh, it was great. In-laws came down, then they left. That was great. He said, well, Eddie, we've got some issues here. You're running 5.12 code on your PBX. You're running 5.12 code. And guess what? I just found out that after December of this next year, we're not going to support that. And I said, Dave, listen to me. I happen to know that we spent $1 million, $978,000 in maintenance. So you know what? This is not my problem, it's yours. Well, Eddie, that's not the way it is. That's just maintenance on what you got. That's just a support on what you got. He says, really, with what you're doing, you should probably be at 614 code. That's probably where you should be. I said, well, Dave, now, I need to do that upgrade then. He says, well, no, it's a little more complicated than that, but don't worry, I'm going to take care of you. You can't go from 512 to 614. You actually have to go 512 to 54, and then you do a hardware upgrade to 58, and then you can get to 62. And man, I wanted to just get sick. Really? It ended up costing me somewhere around after we negotiated and him taking care of me, $48,000 more, and about 5 weekends worth of going in and playing around with this thing to get us there. Yeah. That customers live with that. Customers live with that. And there's a guy with a Avaya who's laughing over here knowing exactly he's done it. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So how did the business case stack up when you went and took that little addition to your management team? Did they just laugh or they cry? What did they do?
What are we going to do? Without this, we're dead in the water.
They
were stuck. They owned us. They owned us. What are we going to do? Do you think the CIO of the business? So let's say that in January, a year later in January, we have a failure, and we call, and our business units are down with phones that they can't use, the most effective, only way they can communicate. And our reason that they're down is because we had a hard time getting them to support us because we're on unsupported code. They're going to line us all up and walk us out the door. Everybody. So we were stuck. We were stuck. And I'm not saying that it's bad, it's just the way it was. It's just the way it was.
I think you're right. I mean, the industry itself, right, whether you call it a cartel or whatever. I mean, I remember Siemens Telecom, I was in the PPA.
Yeah.
So the maintenance part, right, in our quotation, it just said annual maintenance at 20% of the PO value, and nobody negotiated that, right?
No.
The customer would ask us once, 20, that's the industry standard.
That's the industry standard. That's the industry standard. Absolutely. Now, if you want some special stuff, like with an Avaya, they actually had some, they could give you the 18. You could negotiate that stuff down if you wanted to 18 from 20, but they'd try to negotiate you up. Hey, how would you like if this PRI went down, this thing would call out on another PRI to Denver, Colorado, and they would test it for you before you even knew it happened, before your technicians could get to it. They do that. Yeah, it's going to cost you a little bit more, a lot more. This guy's sitting over here crying and laughing because he knows it's all the truth. It's how he made his money, right? It's how they made their money.
But then they also had this things like the software subscription plan that they included also the upgrades and all of that.
Oh, they had all kinds of plans that they would, nothing was free on this thing, but they certainly could add a lot to this.
The worrying thing is that exactly what you're describing here is exactly what happened with also the big switches in, for the PSTN. And
Oh, absolutely. It was the way the whole PSTN, because if you think about it, the PBX is nothing but a smaller part of this, right? It was born out of that. And the service providers had this, and they turned it over to the user, and that was what was expected. And you know what? Customer expectations were that this is the way I'd have to do business.
And if the dialing plan was going to change, also there was a huge impact. You had to change
Absolutely.
all those routing tables.
Oh yes, you had to do that. When I was there, I had all the dial routes, all the routes available for all the country codes and everything in my PBX. If they'd add a new one, I'd have to add it. God, it was crazy. It was crazy. But this is what we had. Now then Cisco comes in, and I would sit here and I'd go over trunk CPU stations and all this, and I added a lot to this. I wouldn't bring up all the bad things about this with the telecom guy. And then I would say, I want to tell you why Cisco is starting out with a clean whiteboard, and here's what they're going to do with IP telephony. Cisco knows nothing about a PBX. I'll be the first to tell you that. I know PBXs and I know Cisco, and they don't know anything about it. But they do know how to deploy applications. And that's what they're really good at. This internet thing. Cisco knows how to make applications work on a network. And Cisco's going to deploy voice as an application.
Was that interest that you had in the what do they call it, the application layer, the
Yeah.
Cisco whatever platform?
Yeah.
Was your interest just a personal interest, or was it really because you thought that's where the future was?
Oh, it's where the future is going to go, yeah.
Trying to really cut costs.
Well, it was part of the change of what's happening. In between Blue Cross and Blue Shield and Cisco, I worked for several companies. I told you I job hopped. One of the jobs I had was with Carolina Power and Light. Carolina Power and Light is an electricity company. They provide electricity into North Carolina and it's part of South Carolina. And one of the things that they wanted to do is they wanted to integrate a PBX, a ACD, a separate ACD, a Rockwell ACD, and their mainframe. And do you know how much that cost them back with all this technology that was not built to even talk to each other? It cost them $70 million to write all the code and do this and do that and do that to make all this work to reach their business objective. Why? Because this thing was built in a closed system. It wasn't built in the era of anything called a computer or programming. It was closed. And it was good for the vendors.
But everything else was closed. AS400.
Absolutely. Everything was. But what we're now that we have client server, when we started deploying client server, what did we start doing? We started opening our eyes that things didn't have to be closed. They didn't have to be closed. Customers started saying, this was the birth of SONA, right? Service-oriented architecture where one application provided a service to another application. Customers were coming up with those ideas themselves. This was a closed system. What Cisco said is we can deploy voice as an application. So what I want you to do is help me here. What do we use in our solution to connect our solution to the PSTN? What device do we use, do we sell, had we sold for years, that connects us up from here to here? A router. We call it a voice gateway. It's a router with special hardware and special software. Just like we did over here. It can connect us up. Where do we hook our phones up to? Where do we hook our phones up to? Where's your PCs hook up to? A switch. A switch. These switches had to have PoE, power over Ethernet, because they certainly weren't going to, we didn't want to put one of these on every phone. Nobody'd ever do that. So we had to provide power over Ethernet. So Cisco built a whole line of switches that did nothing but pre-standard power over Ethernet so we could get customers to see that this could be worked. Until 23 months later, there was a standard for it. A switch. Applications just need routers and switching. They need that. We need an application server, some kind of server up here. That server was communications manager. We called it call manager then. But it's communications manager, it's a server. Down here, where does dial tone come from on that phone? Do we need these cards? Where does dial tone come from on that phone back there? Anybody know?
Just a little app, isn't it? That makes that
Huh?
noise.
It's a WAV file. It's a WAV file on the phone. It's a WAV file. Yes, sir.
Isn't this a prime example of cloud?
Oh, well, it's building your own network cloud for voice inside your network. Yeah, I guess you could look at it that way. But yeah, it's just an application. Routing, switching, and server, right? We have clients out there. The clients, the IP phones are the clients for the server. It's client server. We don't need this. We don't need this. What we need is a QoS architecture that makes sure that on a network where you're sharing the same path with data applications, which have different requirements, that we can differentiate voice from data to make it work. And that's our QoS infrastructure. Today it's not only QoS, but it's secured. It's a secured infrastructure. That's what you want to have. And then they'd say, what about this? And I'd say, this is where it's really cool. I can integrate this with your applications because now it's one application talking to another application. The limitation between your ears. I used to, on my laptop in 2001, I used to have call manager. We had it on my PC running. And I used to have a phone and a switch I'd take in to a customer and I'd hook it all up and I'd have these, I have these little bitty apps that run on the phone, on the screen of those phones like that back there. You know, a little survey app or this, that, and the other. I'd say, this is what we're trying to enable here. We're trying to enable you to release the power of all these applications that you have and change the way you do business. If you think about it, how many people started working from home through dial-up? Anybody remember working through home through dial-up? Yeah. I used to do it all the time. Could you have your phone there if you had a PBX at your office? Could you have your phone there too? You couldn't. You couldn't. Even when you got high-speed internet, you couldn't. PBX was a closed system, locked down. You kind of had to be right there at it. Until it became an application or something I could use on a data network. Then now I can have my phone at home too. I might not even have to go to work, go in every day. Yeah, that's what this unlocked. Folks, I know today this doesn't make relevance, but what it does historically says Cisco drove this network. Cisco is the only company that could have taken on the big hitters, the Nortels, the Avayas of the world, and made this happen. Why? Because it was tough. It was tough. Because Cisco, first of all, didn't know how to talk to the people. Very few of us did. We didn't know how to make business value out of this. All we talk about is, hey, you don't have to move the phone now with cutting wires and everything. You just pick it up and move it like you do your PCs. Add moves and changes are much easier. That was nice. But what the real value was is now you can start integrating all these things. It's very open. You don't have to go expect one vendor to provide everything for you. That's cool, and that's cool. Yes, sir?
Were those IP phones proprietary?
Ours? Absolutely. It's skinny, you know, I told you it was H323, which is a video protocol. They cut the video out and just used the voice side of it. That's why it's called skinny. They call it SCCP, Skinny Client Control Protocol. So it was really H323 without the video. That's what it was. And it was proprietary for us, yes. Because there was no other, the SIP was not out there yet. There was no SIP. And eventually when SIP came, we did it. We did it. So what do you think our competition said about us? Well, first of all, Cisco's expensive. Cisco's expensive. Well, we've always been expensive, and customers say, oh, yeah. But a lot of times the reason we were expensive is because not only were we selling this switching, but we were having to sell maybe new routing and especially new switching for power over Ethernet. So you were actually getting a QoS infrastructure along with your phones. And traditionally the way people bought it is how much is the total cost of the solution divided by the number of phones. And we came up with a number up here, and that's what everybody said. The typical handset in a PBX was $412. That's how much we're going to pay. Well, guess what? Our phones weren't any more expensive than everything, but what drove our costs up was you had to do the switching, you had maybe do the upgrade of the routing, and you had to have a little engineering here. So if I could get a customer to say, let's just talk about the voice side here, and let's talk about the added value of the network separately, I was always cheaper. I was cheaper. But yeah, exactly. But I just talked about, hey, all right, I went into a customer one time and I walked in and I walked into the telecom guy, talked to him for about 2 hours. Great. We had a great conversation. And he was pretty open to this. I was expecting, he was a little about my age, he wasn't young. And he was kind of, yeah, I know it's going to go there and all this. Had a great conversation. Walked back over to my IT side. I said, hey, I just was talking to Steven, your telephony guy, man. I think we've got a good chance here to start looking at IP telephony on your network. And IT almost threw me out of there. IT looked at me and said, you're going to do what? Do you realize my network sucks? A technical term? A technical term? You're crazy. What are you doing to me? You're going to get me fired now. Because these people are up here who have been giving me money think I've got a network that actually works a lot better than it does. And now you're going to really throw me under the bus. And I'd say, listen, man, when we position this, we're going to position it that the network's got to be revisited and all this. Calm down, because they were irate almost. Because customers' networks weren't ready for this. But that's the whole reason Cisco did it. Right? That's the whole reason Cisco did it. If I could put voice on a data network, what are you going to have to do now? What are our core products? Routers and switches. It's drag. It was drag back then. It was drag back then. Yeah.
Does this infrastructure delay the telco's business on the dial plans? No, it didn't delay it at all. No, it had, when we said long distance charges were going to be free, we really hurt them by doing voice over. This is what hurt the telcos. You have to think that there's cost per minute of, I was taking as many phone calls off of here as I could and put it over here. And I'd already negotiated a flat rate here, so guess what? Man, they're in trouble. This is what hurt the telcos. This was directly aimed at the PBX vendors here. This was invading their space. But the telcos are still, with this model, are going to make the same amount of money as that dial.
I'm still going to have to call across here, and I'm still going to do both of those now. Right? But I'm still going to have to call the PSTN. Folks, just because you IP enable, you're on an IP network, does that mean I can call for pizza? No, because they're not on my network. I still have to use the PSTN. My customers are not on that network, my network. I still have to call them. That had very little to do with the PBX vendors didn't care about that at all. Matter of fact, they might even like this because we might have had to buy cards here and here to hook up to our router. They made money on their cards. But it hurt the PSTN, the telcos. This was directly attacking the traditional PBX vendors on what they could do, on what they were selling.